Andy Puzder is the former CEO of CKE Restaurants, the company that oversees fast food chain Hardee's and Carl's Jr. Andy offers a unique perspective into the historic inflation we're currently experiencing, and we're happy to have him on to discuss. Andy Puzder, thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be here, Steve. Thank you.
Andy, the president has just said the pain that we're seeing in the economy right now and that we're feeling is due to international factors. Is that the case, or is there something we could be doing to change the current trajectory?
Well, if you listen to people speaking from the international community, particularly the international financial community, they would all tell you that the problem is that the world currency is the dollar, and that the dollar is strengthened incredibly because of the Fed needing to increase interest rates to drive demand down so we could address the issue of inflation in the United States. So as the world's largest economy and as the world's currency, what happens in the United States makes a lot more difference apparently than President Biden wants to acknowledge. Now, our economy is driving the problems we're having internationally. Now, the Ukraine certainly isn't helping, but things like the shortage of oil and natural gas is obviously due to domestic policy. So the United States bears a lot of responsibility here, and the president ought to just fess up to it and try and find solutions to the problems instead of denying that they exist and going out and getting ice cream.
Economist Stephen Moore and E.J. Antoni just penned an article in the New York Post stating the average American has lost $34,000 since the economy started to shift. Are folks getting that we're preparing to retire having to reconsider?
Yes, they are. And I think the American people understand this. They're obviously, if you look at the polling, they're going to react to what's going on in the economy come the next election. And James Carville said back in 1992 when President Clinton was running for office, he made the motto of that campaign, the campaign slogan, it's the economy, stupid. And in this case, it clearly is the economy. It's going to affect people that are retiring, but it's affecting young people as well. This is an economy where people can't afford to drive like they're used to driving. They can't afford to eat like they're used to eating. These kinds of things are important. You can't feed your family or take them where you want to take them when you want to take them. In the United States, that says that something different's going on, and I think people are upset with where we are today.
Speaking of eating, everyone loves Hardee's and Carl's Jr. You were the CEO of CKE Restaurants. What effect does this type of inflation that we're seeing have on the restaurant industry?
Well, it depends upon the sector. If you're a high-end restaurant chain, you're probably going to lose some business. But people may trade down to the quick service, less expensive restaurant chains. Companies in the middle, like for example, at Chili's or at TGI Fridays. These are the kinds of restaurant chains that will also lose business as people trade down to quick service. So it depends on what sector you're in. The big problem for the quick service sector, which is generally less expensive and something people would gravitate to when there's economic difficulties. The problem is they're having a hard time hiring people to come in and work in the restaurant, so they're not open the hours they'd like to be, and they're not providing the kind of service they'd like to provide. And commodity costs are way up. So even the quick service restaurant chains aren't all that inexpensive anymore. You go into even a Taco Bell or a Kentucky Fried Chicken, some of the lower end in the quick service sector, and even a meal there becomes expensive because proteins are expensive. Everything's up. Delivering, energy costs being up, that raises delivery costs, and that affects the cost of every product you buy, no matter the store, no matter the restaurant. You're going to be hit by this inflation, and restaurants are getting hit like everybody else.
So true. Andy Puzder, thank you so much.
Pleasure, Steve. Thank you.
The U.S. Justice Department is asking a federal judge to sentence former Trump advisor Steve Bannon to 6 months in prison. In July, Bannon initially refused to testify before the January 6th committee. He later agreed but did not provide any of the sought-after documents, such as his financial records. A D.C. federal court then sentenced Bannon on 2 counts of contempt of Congress for defying the subpoena. Prosecutors said today that Bannon has refused to produce a single document for the January 6th committee. This has led them to recommend the maximum prison sentence in the possible range, and prosecutors are also asking that Bannon get the maximum fine of $200,000. They say it's based on his refusal to cooperate with the pre-sentencing financial investigation. Former President Trump is speaking out on the race for New York governor in the November elections. He's endorsing Republican Congressman Lee Zeldin to become the next governor of New York. Trump is telling voters to vote for the Long Island congressman. He wrote on Truth Social on Sunday, quote, "I've watched and known Congressman Lee Zeldin for many years. He is a great and brilliant lawyer who was a must-see for others in Congress when they had a complex legal problem that was holding up legislation. He will be a great governor of New York and has my complete and total endorsement." Zeldin is running against Democratic Governor Kathy Hochul, who is seeking her first full term. According to Real Clear Politics, Hochul's lead has shrunk to about 5 percentage points. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has been widely criticized for sending 50 illegal migrants to Martha's Vineyard, but a mainstream poll shows he's still a favored politician in the United States. NTD's Arlene Richards reports.
Last month, when Florida Governor Ron DeSantis paid to fly 50 illegal immigrants to Martha's Vineyard, critics accused him of lying to the incomers and treating them badly.
So when Biden is flying these people all over the fruited plain in the middle of the night, I didn't hear a peep out of those people, okay?
But a poll released by Statista Research Department a few weeks ago showed that DeSantis had a high net approval rating among Americans. And a new mainstream poll shows he's still a well-liked politician. The poll, conducted by Harvard, Capps, and Harris on October 12 and 13, asked online respondents in the U.S. to rate top political figures. The poll showed DeSantis had the highest net approval rating among major American politicians. The net approval is calculated by subtracting the unfavorable views from the favorable views. 39% of the poll respondents favored DeSantis, while 33% didn't. This resulted in a +6 approval rating. Former Vice President Mike Pence came in second with a +4 rating. Top political rivals have praised DeSantis for his recent handling of Hurricane Ian, including President Biden.
What the governor's done is pretty remarkable.
Other notable results from the poll include GOP approval has risen 4 points in the last 4 months, now at 49%. Democratic Party approval has plateaued after rising, now at 46%. And inflation, the economy, and immigration dominate as top issues facing the country. Arlene Richards, NTD News, New York.
And how did China become a powerful player in the chip-making industry? We have Professor Michael Pecht from the University of Maryland here to discuss Chinese semiconductors and what challenges the U.S. is facing. Professor Michael Pecht, thank you so much for joining us on the Capitol Report.
Good to be here.
Professor, just how has China's semiconductor and electronic industry in general become such a behemoth and essentially a monopoly?
I think it's in part due to the offshoring from the U.S. and in part from Japan, where we had, I guess, a leadership with TI, National Semiconductor, IBM, and other companies. And then those people slowly went to Taiwan and set up the TSMC and other foundries. And then slowly that's moved over to mainland China as well with SMIC and other companies.
And what has you most concerned about China's electronics industry? Is it competition? Is it national security? Combination?
There's probably that combination. And supply chain management is going to be an issue, of course, in the future as well.
And do you think the recently passed CHIPS Act will put a dent in any of this?
I think it's going to take quite a while. Even with the CHIP Act, it's going to take 3 to 4 years to build the facilities, and then it's going to take longer to get the technology up to speed. I personally believe that what might be best for the United States would be to pay a lot of money and get TSMC over here in the U.S., maybe in Austin or New York, someplace like that.
You mentioned supply chain. We often hear about how the pandemic exposed supply chain issues or how we need to be more energy independent for national security reasons. I guess my question is there a clear path to mobilize government to get the U.S. on the right track with regard to chip manufacturing in the U.S.?
I think it's going to be tough for the U.S. right now. Again, I think the companies like Intel are behind. And really, we depend quite heavily in terms of security and the military issues, as well as just regular high technology components on TSMC. So it's going to be quite difficult.
Now, are there loopholes that China uses to acquire military restricted components from the U.S. For China or the People's Liberation Army?
There's lots of loopholes. And when you think about components that go to China to be made into products like computers and iPhones and everything else, those products can always be, siphoned off, the components. Plus, there's other sources through Singapore, India. There's a lot of other opportunities to get components.
Now, this is kind of veering off a little bit. Just want to get your thoughts. Electronic devices, from smoke detectors to microwaves, with Chinese components or Chinese made, from what Intel sources say, can act as essentially listening devices. Is this of a concern to you?
That's not only a concern, but there's also a concern with other kinds of counterfeit parts, and we call Trojan horses that can be embedded into not only the microelectronics, but into the circuit boards themselves as well.
Professor Michael Peck, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Working from home, at least part-time, has become a way of life for many Americans during the pandemic, and it's seemingly no different for the President of the United States. President Biden has spent more than a quarter of his term working from Delaware. That's according to Mark Knoller, the longtime unofficial statistician of the White House press corps. He says so far Biden has spent more than 230 days of his presidency away. He spent 174 days either at his house in Wilmington or his property at Rehoboth Beach in Delaware. The president has also spent 64 days at the Camp David Presidential Retreat in Maryland. That surpasses the getaway time of former President Trump. At this point in his tenure, Trump had spent about 150 days away from the White House. The National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. is welcoming visitors again. This is after it closed for almost 8 months for a large-scale renovation project.
Over half of the artifacts now in these galleries opening today are in the museum for the first time. And behind every artifact is a story. It's typically a story about people. And so we're able to expand the storytelling, tell stories that haven't been told, tell new stories.
The museum has 8 all-new galleries. It's at the midpoint of a 7-year, 2-phase project that will cost $1 billion in total. The museum is now able to reopen the first half while the second half remains under construction. The National Air and Space Museum first opened in 1976 and has had over 350 million visitors. According to its director, it's the most visited of all the Smithsonian museums.